Hello again. Sorry, it's been about 2 weeks since I did my last video. Sorry, I've been very busy, but I'm also excited because, as you can see, I have my White Sox shirt on. I'm a big White Sox fan, and their season's starting soon. Got to watch my first game yesterday. Very excited about it. Hopefully that doesn't determine whether or not you watch this or not, if you're not a Sox fan. So today we're going to be studying Genesis 16 and 17, and like I said, I am planning on doing a series on Revelation as well, and hopefully I'll record. Hopefully I'll have more time to do some more recordings. This will probably be chapters 16 and 17. I think I'm going to do 2 chapters at a time, at least through a lot of Genesis. There will be some parts where that's more in depth. That will be less, so we'll see how that goes. So again, make sure you pause, take some time to read at least chapter 16, and then when we go into chapter 17, you can do the same, and then start up. Again, thanks for watching. I do appreciate you watching. Hopefully you're learning and growing and learning more about the Bible, more importantly about God and Jesus and His Word. So let's begin. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. So go into my servant, and go in my servant, it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarai. So after Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar the Egyptian, her servant, and gave her to Abram, her husband, as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. And Sarah said to Abram, "May the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked at me with contempt. May the Lord judge you between you and me." But Abram said to Sarai, "Behold, your servant is in your power. As to her, do to her as you please." Then Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. So basically what happens, again, we talked about like Abram's, he was a faithful guy in the sense that he did believe God, and it was accredited him as righteous, and he followed God, and he went where God had told him, even though God didn't really tell him to go a specific place, but he went, and he had an issue with Lot, his cousin, or his nephew that we talked about before. They're both him and his wife Sarai are getting older. Sarai thinks, well, maybe I should give Abram my servant Hagar as a wife, and Abram took her as a wife, thinking that God can cause Haggai and Abram to have a great nation that way. And again, this shows you Abraham was not completely faithful to God, because he should have trusted God, that God said, "I will make you a great nation." God doesn't need to give him a surrogate wife or another woman to do that. He can perform what he intended without this. And so after Hagar conceives, she starts looking at Sarai in contempt, like, "I'm better than you. I'm greater than you. I can conceive. I'm going to be the mother of Abram's, which will be Abraham later." And so there becomes a tension between Sarai and Hagar, which they didn't have before, because Hagar was Sarai's servant, and once she became pregnant with Abraham's child, she must have felt like, "I'm better than Sarai," and she started looking at Sarai content. Abram said, "You're my wife." To Sarai, "Do whatever you want with her," which that wasn't the right thing to do either. He should have treated Hagar with more respect, especially since he now is the father of her child. In verse 7, it says, "The angel of the Lord found her by the spring of water in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. And he said, 'Hagar, servant of Sarah, Where have you come from, and where are you going? She said, I am fleeing from my mistress Sarai. The angel said to her, Return to the mistress and submit to her. The angel of the Lord also said to her, I am surely multiply your offspring so they cannot be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said to her, Behold, you are pregnant. You shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has listened to your afflictions. He shall be a wild donkey of a man. His hand is against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he shall dwell over against all his kinsmen. So she called on the name of the Lord, who spoke to her, You are the God of seeing. For she said, Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. Therefore the well was called Belshirah. It lies between Kadesh and Berah. Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of the son whom Hagar bore Ishmael. Abram was 85 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to Abram. So the rest of this story is basically Hagar flees because she's worried, and now she has a child, and this angel appears to Hagar and says, No, go back, be a servant to Sarai just like you were, be a faithful servant to Sarai. I will bless your seed as well, just because of the promise to Abraham, but you should name your child Ishmael. It says he'll be a wild donkey of a man, which means he'll be wild, he'll be crazy, maybe deceptive, which we find out that he is. And but so she submits to the angel and to the Lord, and goes back and submits to Sarai, and lives there. Okay, and so then when Hagar's child is born, Abram names him Ishmael, like it was told. Okay, that includes chapter 16. Now we will go into chapter 17. Again, pause it, read it. I do read along, as you can tell, but the only reason I want you to read it is to get more context, because I read it too. I pause and read it as well. But actually, I read it ahead, so I don't actually pause as I'm doing it. But I'd recommend you do if you haven't done so already. So here's chapter 17. When Abram was 99 years, I'll stop right there for a second, because when Abram had Hagar's child, Ishmael, he was 85. Now he's 99. So if you can figure this, Ishmael is now, if you can do basic math, 14 years old. Okay, 1/4. So he's a teenager. In that generation, teenagers were a little different than our generation. They were probably a little bit more respectful than a lot of our teenagers. If you're a teenager and you're watching this, I'm sure you're very respectful of your parents' wishes. You do what they say. You honor them. They say clean your room, you clean your room. I'm not sure if in this generation that would have happened as well. They would have been very respectful, and I'm sure you're the same way, right? I'm sure. I was the same way. No, actually I wasn't, but we should be. We should be honoring our parents the same way that it is, because God set it up this way, okay? So chapter 17, verse 1. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, I am the God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless, that I may make my covenant between you and me, and that you may multiply you greatly. Then Abram fell at his face, and Abram said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father. And God said to him, Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. So no longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham. Good, now we don't have to have that mix-up that I've been doing through all the videos. It's Abraham now. For I have made you the father of a multitude. I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. Notice how he says that. I have made. It's past tense, even though he hasn't had a child with Sarah yet, which he will have soon. I will make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. So God reestablishes the fact that he has a covenant with Abraham, and he says, or Abram, that he has a covenant. And so he says, I'm going to make you into great nations. So there'll be multiple nations. And some would assume, well, then it could be, one nation could be Ishmael's nation, and one nation could be the son that he will have with Sarai, which we'll talk about soon. But it's actually multitudes, like more nations than that, like crazy numbers of nations is what he's referring to. Now he changes Abram's name to Abraham, and he's going to change Sarai's name to Sarah. It says Sarah with an H, and I'll explain to you what that means and why that is in just a second. Verse 7, I will establish my covenant between you and your offspring, and after you throughout their generations, an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and your offspring after you. I will give to you and your offspring after the land of the sojourners, all the land of Canaan, for an everlasting possession. I will be their God. So God's promising not only is he going to make them a great nation, but he's going to give them land to possess. Okay? In verse 9 it says, and God said to Abram, as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring, after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between you and me. For he who is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generations, whether born in the house or bought with your money from your foreigner, is not of your offspring. But he who is born in your house, and he who is bought with your money, shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant. And any uncircumcised male is not circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin shall be cut off from the people. He has broken my covenant. So God starts this covenant with Abraham, and he talks about circumcision, which I'm not going to go into detail about circumcision. You probably know what that is. You could look it up online what circumcision is if you don't know what that is. But basically that was the sign of circumcision, that every male in the house of God who followed them needed to be circumcised. And every child, when they're 8 days older or beyond, needs to be circumcised. So every male child needs to be circumcised when they're 8 days older and 8 days after the birth, they're to be circumcised. And this is the covenant that God is making. And I think the circumcision has to do with the blood. You know, again, like we talked about in the early part of Genesis, that with every sin, something has to die. There's representative blood. And so the circumcision represents blood. When you have that procedure done, it causes you to bleed. It's also very painful, especially if you're an adult. When you're 8 days old, it's very painful as well, but you don't remember it. If you're a man, you understand more than a woman, maybe, in that sense. Well, maybe not, because if you're a woman and you've had children, you may have witnessed this act done to your male children. So it's, but it can be very painful, especially for adults and for children. But obviously for adults, it's probably a little bit more painful because you can remember the experience. But the circumcision was designed to set the covenant between God and man. Now notice how Abraham, we just said Abraham is 99. God is now telling him to do this covenant. Abraham at this point is not circumcised. He's 99 years old. So we're talking about pain. We're going to go into that in a second. Okay, and again, we'll talk about why God changed Sarai and Abram's names to Sarah and Abraham. Okay, so then in verse 15 it says, God said to Abraham, as for Sarai your wife, you shall not call her Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and more, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and you shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Okay, I want to stop there for a second, and I just want to make sure to clarify something here. Now, we've noticed that Abraham was faithful in the sense that he answered God's call and went, even though God didn't tell him where to go, okay? But he has not been truly faithful along the way. He's done many things, like lying to Pharaoh about his wife being his sister, also taking on Hagar as a wife and trying to produce the offspring that God promised him through another woman. Okay, so he's not the greatest faithful man in that sense. But the key here to understand is that God made Abram a promise. And when God makes a promise, God fulfills the promise. God tells Abraham, you will be a great nation. You will be a great nation. So when God promises something to you, like in the New Testament it says, he who started a good work in you will bring it to completion. If God started a good work in you, even though you might be struggling or having some issues, God will bring it to completion. And it's important to know this, that when God makes a promise, God fulfills the promise, whether or not we are faithful to that, to God or not. He will still carry out the promise, which is good because it gives us hope that it gives us assurance that even though we may sin as followers of Jesus, God is still faithful and will bring us to the point where we'll be fully right with him when we die and we'll go to heaven. So even though we may sin as a Christian, we don't lose what God has promised because God is faithful to his promises, even though we may not be faithful to ours, if that makes sense. And I think it's very important to understand that. So this is why God is saying, I will make you a great nation, even though Abraham was being a bozo again, or was. So then in verse 17 it says, Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to me, a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abram said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, No, but Sarah, your wife, will bear you a child, and you shall call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you, and behold, I have blessed him, and will make him a great nation, and multiply him greatly. He shall father 12 princes, and I will make him into a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac when Sarah shall bear you, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this time next year. So God is making a huge statement here, a huge promise. So he's saying he's going to make Ishmael a great nation, but he's not going to use him as the covenant that God promised Sarah and Abraham. So God promised them to make a covenant with them. The covenant is not going to be fulfilled through Ishmael, even though Ishmael will be a great nation. The covenant will be fulfilled in Isaac. And he says, you will have the child by this time next year, which if we understand the pregnancy process, typically a pregnancy is 9 months, which means Sarah is going to be pregnant in 3 months. Again, I'm going to explain the Abraham and Sarah thing at the end. Hopefully I remember. Hopefully you're getting excited and want to know, and maybe I'll forget and not say it, and then you'll have to figure it out yourself. But hopefully I don't. When he had finished, okay, this is verse 22. When he had finished talking with him, God went up to Abraham. Then Abraham took Ishmael his son and all that born in his house, and bought with his money every male among, or brought with his money. He brought his son and anybody he bought into slavery, and I'll explain that too as well, with him up to Abraham's house. He circumcised the flesh of all their foreskins that very day, and as God had told him, said. Abram was 99 years old when he was circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin. Ishmael his son was 13 years old. Okay, this is 13, so he hasn't hit his 14th birthday yet, but it was close. When he had circumcised in the flesh of his foreskin, that very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised. All the men of his house were born into the house, bought by money from a foreigner, was circumcised with him. So, two things real quick. We're going to go into this and we'll end this, but two important factors here is Abraham gets circumcised, Ishmael gets circumcised, and all the males are circumcised, and anybody he even bought. So the context here is yes, he bought people. And what we have to understand is in that day and age, you would buy people and they would be what we call slaves. Now, it's not the slaves in the sense of what we understand from this history of slavery. The Bible teaches about slavery. It's fine to own slaves as long as you treat them with respect and dignity and you pay them wages that are fine. And that is all right. Now, the context of what we're used to in this country, that slavery was terrible. They, whipped other people. We hear about all these types of slavery. That's not what the Bible wants. God wants you to treat your slaves, or as we would call them, sometimes you can even call them, referred to as employees. Your employees, if you own a company, you need to treat them with respect and dignity and give them a fair wage and all that stuff. And that's what Abraham would have done in this time frame, okay? So they weren't like mistreated. So when it says he bought them, he did buy them, and a lot of them would have actually sold themselves into it to pay off some debt that they may owe, and then they're part of Abraham's household. The other thing is, so we talk about who, the circumcision, they all get circumcised. Who circumcised Abraham? Well, he circumcised himself. Abraham would have had to circumcise himself. So if you're talking about the pain of circumcision, it'd be really painful because Abraham had to do it to himself. But then he also circumcised his son, who's 13, Ishmael. Isaac does not get circumcised because Isaac isn't born yet. Isaac will be born in a year, and then after 8 days he will be circumcised, and all the household. So you can imagine there's a lot of pain and suffering that's going on with this circumcision thing, which we're going to get into a chapter soon that it's an interesting chapter, and I'll save you for that. I won't give you any details. Now, to end this, I just want to tell you real quick, and I know this is getting to 21 minutes. The reason God changes Abram and Sarai to Abraham and Sarah is God adds an H in the middle of Abraham's name, and he puts an H at the end of Sarai's name, which is where you get Abraham. I mean, he goes Abram to Abraham, so he puts H-A-M. Now, again, I don't speak Hebrew. I don't understand Hebrew. I don't know a lot of it, but I know some things. In the Hebrew alphabet, the letters aren't only letters, but they each have an individual meaning. Like some of our letters have meanings, some of them don't. But all the Hebraic letters have meanings. The H in Hebrew actually means love. I don't know if you know that. It's something to learn. The Hebrew letter H means love. So you could say that God put love into Abraham and Sarai, or Abram and Sarai, and made them Abraham and Sarah. So some would say God put his own love into them. That would be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or anything, please leave a comment. If not, hopefully you enjoyed it, and we will do the next 2 chapters very shortly. Have a great day, and hopefully I will talk to you soon.